Welcome everyone to our Monday evening forum, in which we're going to have a series of 5 position pieces and lectures, if you like, mini lectures on the topic of climate change and energy. So really lovely to see so many participants here this evening. And before I go on to introduce the speakers, I hope you'll allow me to just take a minute to introduce myself. So I'm Charlotte Williams. I am a professor in the chemistry department, and I'm the fellow of inorganic chemistry here at Trinity. And I guess the reason that I've been asked to compare this discussion this evening is that my own research sits in the area of the chemistry of energy, but also the chemistry of plastics and polymers. And in particular, in my research group, we've looked for several decades at how we can make plastics from unconventional raw materials. So that's more than enough about me. The spotlight this evening is on our 5 speakers. And the way that we're going to run this Zoom meeting is that each speaker will have 5 to 10 minutes to put their piece to you, the audience. And please do feel free to use the chat function to put in some questions for the speakers. And I will then invite you to put your question, or if the connectivity is not sufficiently good, I can put the question to the different speakers, and we can have them reflect on this big and very important topic of climate change and energy. So I think that's all the things that I need to say to you. Everybody has now a very good Zoom protocol, so we all understand about using the mute and so on, and I'm sure everyone understands how to use the chat. But if there's any concerns as the meeting is ongoing, please do make contact with Sarah, who's here on the call, and she can help with those kinds of issues. At least I hope she can. So now let me begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Mark Allaway. And Mark, it's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. You studied physics originally at Trinity, but you've had many years of successful business work in, I think, the International Finance Corporation. And the floor is yours, Mark, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's a pleasure to be here, and I understand I get to speak first because I'm the oldest. So I matriculated first in 1977, as you say, in physics. And I've done many things since then. And most recently, I've been working on the fringes of climate change since I retired from the IFC World Bank in 2017. I've been chairing the accreditation panel for the Green Climate Fund based out of Korea. So what I want to do in my presentation is first look at what I think are the main areas that impact energy and climate change, the fundamental areas, then look at what has happened during COVID and what might affect climate change during COVID and after COVID. And then finally look at some big areas that need to come together to make climate change work. So is it possible to share the presentation, Sarah? Yes, thanks. So yes, that's me with an upside down reflective world. So there's number 1, yes. Top of my list is public opinion, which I think is the biggest driver. And public opinion has definitely moved in the right direction because of key public figures, because of a lot of focus on it. And I think public opinion will continue to be important. Global cooperation is extremely important. The Paris Accord is extremely important. But I think the COVID has exposed weaknesses in global cooperation. COVID has been a rapid crisis. I think climate change is a medium, longer term crisis. So there's more time to deal with it. But there's been weaknesses exposed in global cooperation, particularly with the distribution and rollout of vaccine programs. I won't dwell on money at the moment, but it's very important and we'll come back to it. Science is obviously important, and it'll be interesting. Charlotte hopefully will comment more on some of the work she's doing in that area. Politics and regulation, I think, go together. the problem with politics is it's very important, but the horizon of a politician is somewhat short term. They tend to go very much on public opinion, and they're driven by what will get them votes at the next election. However, they can put in place longer term measures through regulation. And I think that's where they can make the difference, and they're increasingly doing it to reduce emissions. So I think regulation and politics go together. Pandemics, question mark, are pandemics going to help climate change and energy, and COVID in particular? I'm not sure about that, but let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So I've tried to think through, and this is not an exhaustive list, but where were we pre-COVID? What's happened during COVID with respect to possible impacts on climate change, and what will happen post-COVID? So obviously, there's been a lot less travel. There's been working from home, more online shopping, Amazon and online supermarkets. How much of this will stay? I'm not sure. I think there's a huge pent-up demand for travel, particularly holidays. You see with the announcements of the easing of lockdown, there was a huge boost in holiday bookings. I think people want to get back to travel, maybe not business travel to the same extent. Maybe people will work from home, but I think people want to travel, and businesses will want to get back in business, and governments will want them to. They're worried about economies. So I think there's going to be a big push to have a big bounce back in business and economy. And I don't think that's necessarily good for the climate change, but I think that's bound to happen in the short term. Politics, well, we've had 4 years of Trump, and he's not been good for climate change. He's almost certainly lost the election due to COVID. And now we've got Biden for the next 4 years, which is good. He's rejoined the Paris Accord and a number of other measures, but he's got an uphill battle. There's still 70+ million Americans who voted for Trump, and they probably still believe that climate change is a hoax. Can we go back? Yep, thanks. But it's not just the US. The US is extremely important, but there are other countries, such as Brazil. And Brazil, the leader there, Bolsonaro, was very much following the lead of Trump. He's done a lot of damage to climate change, I think, in the Amazon. So, hopefully with Trump losing, that might mean that also some of the populist governments will lose power as well. Big oil companies, will come back to that. I think they've had big losses, but they'll definitely survive. And will they become big energy companies? That's the question. Has pollution gone down during COVID? I think at the margin, yes, maybe. Some cities have reported being cleaner, but I don't think there's accurate data showing that greenhouse gas emissions have gone down during COVID. I think it's far too early to expect that. And I also don't think that it will have significantly moved the needle, and I think greenhouse gas emissions will go up. So I think fossil fuels, they were there before, they were there during COVID. I think they're still going to be there, certainly in the medium term. So if we move to the next slide, please. I see I've gone off the screen. Did I cut my, was that me? I'm still on video. Anyway, I can't see myself on the screen. I don't know if I'm still on the screen. Not to worry. Anyway,
all is good, Mark. All is good.
Okay, thanks. So what I've tried to do in this last slide is say, what are the sort of things, the big thoughts that sort of come together rather like a jigsaw puzzle, but a fluid jigsaw puzzle where things will sort of connect and overlap and join and then sort of come apart and continue to come together over time. And obviously big oil companies are very important to climate change. I think they have the muscle to become big green energy companies. Certainly Shell is leading the way. BP is not far behind. They've both announced that they intend to be carbon neutral by 2050. And I think they have every possibility of achieving that. The US oil companies, the big ones, Exxon, Chevron, are some way behind, maybe because of the policies of Trump. But they are going to get there. They will catch up. The big powers, as I've mentioned, the US, Brazil, the European Union, very important, but China also. I mean, China is going to do what's good for China. And their economy, their industry is very important to them. But they've got to be part of global cooperation, as do all the other big developing countries. Big names have done a lot. Bill Gates, Sir David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and Greta particularly has raised this with a younger generation that are fighting for change, which I think is excellent. And so I think this will continue to change. Big risks. Sir David Attenborough recently made an impassioned speech at the Global Security Council of the importance of climate change to global security, food, water, sanitation, and health, and particularly in the more vulnerable parts of the world, the more vulnerable countries. What are the big changes? So here, big changes, I wanted to highlight the difference between environmental, social, and governance performance, ESG performance, and climate change. 40 years ago, nobody was really thinking of climate change. 20 years ago, companies started to be rated on their environmental, social, and governance performance. And various stock market indices in the UK, led by FTSE, created an index called the FTSE for Good that rated companies on their performance against a number of measures of environmental, social, and governance. And over time, companies have taken that very seriously, and now it's very important to them that they have high ratings for environmental, social, and governance. And the big money, the investors, the stock market, the banks, the insurance companies, the pension funds, their trustees want to see money going into responsible investors, in responsible companies with high levels of environmental, social, and governance. What's needed for the future in climate change, addressing climate change, is companies that mitigate and adapt to a low carbon environment. And the difference is really about how a company does its work, that is good to the environment, versus what they're doing. And I'll give an example of two companies, Nike and Michelin that makes tires. Nike certainly used to be very high on ESG. They don't employ child labor, they're good to their staff, they manage all their effluents and they use a lot of water, but inherently their business model is that we all want a new pair of shoes and clothes and everything else. So, and what they sell uses a lot of materials that are not necessarily recyclable. So inherently they're bad for the environment, but they're good. So they're bad for climate change, but they're good for the environment. Michelin, on the other hand, you would think would be very bad for the climate because their business is inherently making tires and using rubber. But they've actually put a lot of effort into becoming carbon neutral. I'm not sure if they already are, but they were doing things like big plantations in Indonesia, where they were building forests with rubber trees, obviously, and employing people. So they've actually done a lot to go down the direction of becoming carbon neutral, even though their business is inherently not good for the environment. And then, so big money is going to follow. If companies can be assessed on their ability to mitigate and adapt, that's where the big money needs to go. And the amount of money needed to really move the needle for the paradigm shift is trillions and trillions of whatever, pounds, dollars, whatever. So it's a lot of money, and it's the private sector, the stock markets that need to move that money. And finally, I put this final bubble, the big gap, because I believe in the medium term, the short to medium term, fossil fuels will continue to be important for the big developing countries like China, but also for developed countries are still very much using fossil fuels. And it's going to take a while to move to greener alternatives. You see, even in Texas, the problem they had recently with the very cold spell was that their base level of energy had moved to green power and just wasn't producing the power they needed. Plus there's other factors of lack of investment and deregulation and et cetera, but they didn't have the base power they needed. And I think you'll see they're going to move back in a big way to fossil fuels, which is unfortunate, even though I think they're the state with the most windmills across the whole of the US. So how can the big gap be bridged in the medium term? And I think the answer is nuclear power, and I think it needs to be on the table. And I know it's very controversial, but the countries that have put in place nuclear power, and France is an example, and if you compare it to Germany, that's said no nuclear power, taken a completely different route. I think that nuclear power is important in the medium term, but I know it's controversial. So on the final slide, and apologies to Charlotte, I haven't totally stuck to the brief, but if we go to the final slide, I am going to answer her final question, the important question. Will we be net zero in the next decade? And unfortunately, I'm pessimistic on that. I think 10 years is too short a time, even 10 to 15 years. But I do think that by the mid to late 40s, there is a possibility that we will be carbon neutral, the current will be carbon neutral. So hopefully for the existing cohort of Trinity students, if they continue to put pressure and drive public opinion in whatever they do and all their work, I think that there could be carbon neutral by 2050. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much. Yeah, it was an excellent start to time, a very interesting position, and I know that there will be lots of questions. I see some already. What I want to do is give all speakers a chance to run through, and then we do the Q&A afterwards. So please do keep typing in your questions, but exactly, we will now go to Lynn Mays. So Lynn, you're really welcome here this evening. Lynn studied modern languages at Trinity, but she is now she has founded a management consultancy called Mad World, and this consultancy brings together the private sector, NGOs, local government to work on challenges around plastics and packaging in New Zealand. So I hope that I've got this more or less right, Lynn, but over to you for your position, please.
Thanks, Charlotte, and I think I am, as Mark said, he's the eldest and I'm the next oldest in line, and I've somehow got used to all of mentioning my date of birth and indeed my body weight, as I do weightlifting as a sport. There's nothing, normally at the back of me when I'm doing a presentation, it has my year of birth and my weight, two things you should never ask a woman. Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koutou katoa. I te kaupapa o te rā, tēnā koutou katoa. Tuia te rangi, tuia te papa, tuia te mara, tuia tātou. E rangi te pō, e rangi te o, hui e, homi e, tākie. I've started with a mihi whakato, which is a Maori greeting, and used to commence meetings here. And it's become increasingly common as an introduction at all meetings in New Zealand. At the heart of the Maori way of life is kaitiakitanga, or guardianship for the sky, the land and the sea, and for the processes and practices of protecting and looking after the environment. Amidst the silence during lockdown level 4 in 2020, the natural world re-emerged. Here, at least in New Zealand, there were very few vehicles on the road. Only supermarkets and pharmacies were allowed to open. We were afforded the time to walk around our immediate vicinity and find places which we hadn't had the time to visit before. And we started seeing and hearing native birds in our neighbourhood. We now know what we're missing. The Climate Change in New Zealand is currently consulting on policy development to deliver on its emissions reduction targets by 2050. To achieve this, we need to understand that all things are connected: the people, the land, the atmosphere, the oceans. The key sectors where policy will be implemented are agriculture, forestry, transport, energy, and waste. My business is very focused on the waste sector, supporting businesses, particularly in making decisions about sustainable packaging and how to ensure packaging is designed to be reused or recycled and not sent to landfill. In 2018, waste emissions made up 10% of total methane. Most waste emissions are from solid waste decomposing at landfill. The role of packaging is actually to protect and preserve products and to prevent waste. Manufacturers choose packaging based on a range of criteria, and one of the largest issues facing us today globally is the scale of food waste. at the front end in production and resource use, and then most particularly at the end of it. Good packaging can improve longevity of food and be part of a solution in reducing the volume of food waste. But what is good? Plastic packaging is generally perceived as bad. Its image is quite rightly tainted by the impact of discarded plastic packaging on our oceans and biodiversity. However, plastic has excellent functionality and versatility. It's lightweight, hygienic, strong and durable, and it's used universally around the world. Plastic packaging provides a better carbon footprint than other materials such as glass, metal, paper, particularly when the plastic container is recycled. Plastic's light and it requires less energy and fuel to transport than glass, for example. A PET jar ships 1,000 kilometres, saves 19 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent compared to a glass jar. So moving away from plastic to other materials may increase New Zealand's carbon footprint and likely increase the carbon miles of food and beverages shipped from New Zealand around the world. So striking a balance between reducing plastic in the produce aisles and limiting methane emissions from food is a balancing act. The supermarkets in New Zealand, as in other countries, have unwrapped produce. However, say that for some produce, plastic packaging is necessary to extend shelf life to reduce food waste. Methane from food waste is a major focus for the supermarkets here, and changes to packaging need to be balanced. For example, whilst wrapping a cucumber in plastic seems wasteful, that 2 grams of plastic gives an extra 10 days of shelf life across the supply chain. Plastic packaging is recyclable when collection systems are in place and can be reprocessed into durable plastic products, retaining its value. Recyclability is dependent, though, on having collection systems and processing capacity. New Zealand's a large geographic mass, similar in size to the United Kingdom, with a population of 4.9 million spread across 2 islands. We're on the other side of the world to most markets, including markets for waste. With good processing systems for PET plastic, commonly used in drinks containers and food punnets, with some processing capacity for HDPE milk bottles, etc. And over 95% of New Zealanders have access to curbside recycling for these products. I set up and manage the soft plastics recycling scheme, which provides collection bins at supermarkets and other stores so consumers can drop off their soft plastic bags and wrappers. These are turned into plastic fence posts here in Auckland. In 2020, the government declared plastic packaging to be a priority product, which means that all users of plastic packaging will need to become part of a regulated scheme. Government policy is also moving towards banning hard-to-recycle plastics such as PVC and polystyrene. This is broadly supported by industry, which is already phasing these materials out. Transitioning to other packaging materials, they may solve one problem, but cause others. The impacts of the China sword policy on markets for mixed plastic also impacted the paper and cardboard market. A recent assessment of the fibre market for New Zealand finds that 64% of fibre consumption is recovered for recycling, and we only have markets in New Zealand for less than half of this. The way we collect our recycling in New Zealand is a major problem for paper. Many councils collect all recycled commingled in a single recycling bin, which means paper is contaminated with glass, plastic pieces, etc. And so it won't meet the quality requirements for processing either here in New Zealand or globally. Sorry. There are multiple policy frameworks now to address the problem. Plastic packaging will require a mandatory product stewardship scheme. The government is assessing the options for a beverage container deposit system. There'll be a significant increase in the waste levy and a move to standardise curbside collections across New Zealand. But it is somewhat ironic that as we target zero waste, we're continuing to build new landfills. And this is a picture that on the right there is a beautiful valley, Dome Valley, just north of where I live in Auckland. And it's the proposed site for a new landfill. So as chair of the Auckland Conservation Board, I have been speaking against that at various hearings. It'll be interesting to see what the result is. So yeah, thank you, and I'll take any questions at the end.
Thank you so much. This was very thought-provoking and clearly going to raise a lot of questions about the interesting work you've done in turning waste into new materials. So as per our schedule, we'll now proceed to Claire Palmer's lecture. And Claire is studied theology here at Trinity and is a professor at Texas A&M in liberal arts and philosophy. And her research interests there at Texas A&M are around the ethical questions raised by aspects of the environment and conservation, but also the ethical questions raised by climate change. So Claire, welcome, over to you.
Hi, thanks very much. So those were both really great talks. So thanks to both of you. So as a philosopher, I guess, my perspective on this is going to be a bit different from some of the other speakers, but that's great. I'm just going to throw out some ideas because I think they might provoke questions from people. So philosophers have been interested in climate change in various different ways, but I think one kind of key way has been as a set of conceptual problems. And then in another sense, philosophers have also been doing much more applied work. So working in teams with people from other disciplines and from governmental agencies and so on, to think about the kind of social and ethical implications of strategies and policies to deal with climate change. So I thought I'd say something briefly about both those kinds of approaches here, maybe a bit more about the conceptual one than the others. So I think most of the ethicists who work in climate change say, look, climate change is fundamentally a problem about values and a problem about justice. So the reason why we care about climate change is because it's threatening to damage the health and well-being of people that are currently alive, the health and well-being of people that don't yet exist, so future people, the places and landscapes with which we're familiar. And I think that slide Lynn put up of the bird, in the places that might change because of climate change, and the species and ecosystems with which we've evolved. Climate change will have an impact on all of those things. And it's also troubling because it's likely to amplify the existing issues of poverty, marginalization, racial discrimination, and social injustice. So it's important for those reasons too. And which is another thing that Lynn said, it's not just climate change itself that's likely to have these important impacts on justice and the things that we value, but also the ways in which we respond to it and the policies we adopt. So policies that aim at net zero by changing energy types. So Mark was saying, nuclear power is a controversial issue that would have ethical implications if we switched in that direction. Carbon capture and adaptation policies and projects like retreats from the ocean, all of those will have implications too. So it's not just climate change itself, it's the ways that we respond to it. But climate change is, as I'm sure everyone knows, this very complicated, it's what's sometimes called a wicked problem. It's unprecedented. We don't have examples of other things that have been like it. It's mixed up with lots of other problems. There are lots of deep uncertainties about what's going to happen. There are significant ethical disagreements, and then there are disagreements even about what the problem is or whether it actually exists. So trying to deal with it runs into a whole range of really complicated and difficult issues. And one thing I thought I'd say here is that some of those issues, not all of them, are a bit like the problems about ethics and justice that we've seen in the current pandemic. So I thought that would be a useful lens for, since we're supposed to be imagining a post-COVID world, for thinking through this. So one challenge that's raised by COVID-19 is the balance between protecting personal liberty and promoting collective goods. So one of the things that the pandemic has meant is that carrying out normally morally acceptable personal freedoms, like mixing with your friends and not having to wear a face mask, actually contributes to serious threats to the well-being of others. But people's voluntary compliance with this has been pretty patchy, especially in the United States. So that led governments to respond, different governments and different states in different ways, to constrain citizens' otherwise perfectly rightful activities in order to lower the risk of very serious harms to others, and by introducing lockdowns and so on. And climate change, of course, raises this issue too. So driving a petrol truck, kicking the air conditioning up on high, flying thousands of miles for work, all of these are pleasurable and convenient activities that people have for a long time thought that they had a right to enjoy, even though enjoying them now potentially creates a risk of serious harm to others, and indeed even to ourselves, but fairly indirectly. And so this seems to me to be a way in which the pandemic might be thought of as being a kind of warning for climate change, because COVID-19 created fairly immediate threats to relatively close others. So you are likely to harm people close to you and yourself, for instance, by not wearing a mask. But would people choose to comply with enduring restrictions on personal freedoms when they're dealing with relatively distant threats to distant others, where there's no clearly discernible benefit to other people from complying? You don't see the effects of what you do. The people that might benefit are going to be thousands of miles away potentially, or not yet born. So one of the main ethical and political issues here, I think, is how far governments should be willing to constrain freedoms and how far they should adopt policies of nudging or incentivizing us to behave differently in order to avoid massive harms to humans that are distant from us across space and time. So that's one kind of conceptual issue that seems really important. Another is that the pandemic raised justice issues that seem very like those that have been being raised by climate change. So within Western societies, the impacts of the pandemic haven't been evenly spread. So hospitalizations and deaths have been higher in already marginalized communities and in communities of color, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And we would expect, and indeed we're already seeing, similar uneven impacts of climate change. And the reasons are to some degree similar, that marginalized communities are more vulnerable, both to COVID-19 and to the impacts of climate change, and they find it more difficult to avoid exposure. And so examples of that, in Texas, Hurricane Harvey, which is thought to have been supercharged with huge amounts of rain due to climate change, saw poor communities of color living in areas highly vulnerable to flooding. Unlike wealthier communities, they couldn't afford to protect their homes. They couldn't afford to move to hotels. Some of them didn't have cars. They couldn't drive elsewhere. And then they were further exposed to additional pollution from flooded oil refineries and so on after the hurricane had happened. So we see similar kind of pattern of worries about injustice with the COVID-19 and with climate change. But I also think there are ways in which climate change raises other justice issues that were less raised by COVID-19. So international justice issues, now obviously there are international justice issues about COVID-19, like about vaccine distribution, but I don't think they're as intense as the ones raised by climate change, where you have countries at risk of extreme weather events that are poor, with a high reliance on agriculture and lacking the financial tools to respond to the threat. And these countries haven't produced much in the way of greenhouse gas emissions in comparison with wealthy countries, but they're suffering the impacts of behaviors from which they haven't benefited. So that's one of the major kind of international justice issues that's raised by climate change. But it also raises the problem about justice between generations that has not also been a major part of the pandemic, or at least not this pandemic. So future generations don't much benefit from our greenhouse gas emissions, and they can't participate in current discussions about climate policy, obviously, because they don't yet exist. And yet they're the ones that are likely to carry the heaviest burdens of present and past emissions. And one of the main kind of arguments that philosophers have tried to pursue is the idea that your time of birth doesn't affect your basic value, that people who were born in 100 years are worth the same as people that are born today. But then that raises questions about, well, if that's the case, how should that shape our policy now? How should the interests of future people be represented, and how much weight should they carry when we think about policy discussions about climate change? So that's the conceptual stuff I was going to talk about. And then I just wanted very briefly to say something about more applied work that philosophers have been doing. And here it's actually most interesting, I guess, to talk about what I've been doing myself. So I've been working with biologists and conservationists, thinking about the social and ethical implications of conservation strategies in the face of climate change. So thinking about what kinds of ecological values does climate change threaten? Are there some beings or things or ecological processes that we should protect at all costs? What kinds of values should we be willing to sacrifice or trade off if we have to do that? And more specifically, how far should we go down interventionist paths, for instance, moving species around and putting them in places where the climate will be more suitable for them in order to protect, say, species that are threatened. And I recently served on a National Academy of Science committee in the United States that was looking at the question whether we should use biotechnology, so gene editing in particular, to protect and promote forest health. So increasingly in the United States, and I think in the UK, there are whole tree species in national forests that are being threatened by invasive diseases and native pests that are much more abundant due to climate change and due to the change in climate itself. So the question is, should we genetically modify tree species to be more resistant to pests that we've got because of climate change, or more resilient to rising temperatures and changing climates? If we do something like that, we could keep endangered tree species. So in the US, the white bark pine and the green ash are two trees that are threatened, but they would be genetically modified. Does it matter? Is it morally acceptable to save species but lose naturalness or wildness? What should we think about? How should we consult with people like the native communities that have lived with these trees for thousands of years? These are very complicated ethical questions. Lots of people disagree about them. Lots of public consultation is needed about them. But these kinds of technologies with respect to climate change are clearly coming down the pike. So one of the things that philosophers have been doing have been trying to get ahead of those ethical discussions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating final question, and I'm quite sure that it raises many more in the audience's mind. At least for me, it's immediately making me think if it's even possible to do this successfully and all the unintended consequences that could arise. But I'm sure, Claire, you will pick these up in your answers. And yeah, thank you so much for a beautiful position piece, both on the set of conceptual problems and some concrete examples of teamwork. So I want to come on now to welcome Mark Sadler to the discussion. And Mark studied law here and is a manager of climate funds at the World Bank, climate funds management at the World Bank. And he's going to talk through a just transition and the race to zero. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks ever so much. It's so interesting. We're all coming at this, the elephant, from different angles. So this is probably a bit of a step change because the work I do is with sovereign governments on how do they implement, how do they finance, and how do they manage their economies. And of course, when we look at what are the big issues that lie before governments, climate change, no doubt is the biggest variable that is going to fundamentally alter their economies of the future. Either because they're impacted by climate change, and fundamentally that will have physical impacts that are very obvious. In Africa, that means more droughts, and that means more starving people. In the south of England, it means flood insurance won't work anymore because you will be flooded on such a regular basis that it will be an uninsurable risk. And as we look across the planet, there is nowhere that you can go that will not be impacted by climate change. And that raises, and Claire was just talking there about the ethical side of it. That raises serious issues around the humanitarian agenda and the desperate need to protect the vulnerable. And in doing that, remembering that the vulnerable today are not necessarily the vulnerable tomorrow. The people who you would consider not to be vulnerable today will be tomorrow. Anyone who bought real estate on small island developing states because of the beautiful coral reefs and wonderful scuba diving will very soon, within the next 20 years or so for some of them, be owning property that is submerged underwater. And so if we look at some of those countries, there are serious legal issues about actually where the population will go because the country will actually be underwater. So there's this adaptation issue, and that impacts not just the poorest of the poor, but it impacts them much worse than anyone else. but it also impacts everyone today who hasn't quite realized it yet. And if your, you know, if your insurance is going up for certain risks in certain part of the world, this is exactly why, right? What we'd call the tail curve in risk, the things that happen 1 in 100, many of those things are now happening 1 in 20, 1 in 50. That just means that your insurance premiums go up. And the second part of the big issue, and here we were talking about climate and energy, is that this is one of those really, some refer to the wicked problem. This is a self-reinforcing problem. And the way that we currently manage the natural resources on the planet that we live on is causing us to create the problems that are now impacting us. And so lack of action will lead to a much worse situation, but much quicker. So this is all about time. You know, the planet has adapted tens, hundreds of times over the past millions and millions of years. And the world has adapted. And that's what I, used to hear as I traveled through the middle of America talking to farmers. Oh, we've been here before, we've seen this before. Things change. The speed of change today is nothing we have ever seen on this planet before. And that's why in certain circles, people talk about a planet killer. Because the planet has been able to adapt to the previous cycles that we have seen. This is moving so fast that we cannot adapt quickly enough at the moment. And the systems that we have that sustain our lives and livelihoods on the planet are causing the problem as well. So we need to do both. We need to adapt, we need to deal with the problem as it is today. All the energy is already locked into the atmosphere. Sea level rise is going to happen. There is that amount of energy already in the atmosphere that a lot of the ice will melt, the sea levels will rise. The issue is, how do we stop it rising even further than is already locked into the global math? A lot of this is just mathematics. I'm really sorry to take what is such an emotive and personal issue and turn it into something like math. But until we actually get to that point of the discussion about A plus B equals C, and C is non-manageable, then we keep on getting lost in rhetoric and what are effectively divisive arguments. So the issue today, as I was talking about, was about energy. Energy is a large part of our current levels of GHG emissions, and it is one of those sectors that will have to go through a major transition. It's like steam trains to electric trains. Right? Fundamental shift in technology, fundamental shift in the way that we do it. The emissions that are currently locked into the current pathway of emissions for business as usual energy. Okay. We're not talking +2 world, we're not talking +8 world, we're talking much higher. And in certain parts of the world, you're talking way above +10 degrees. Animals die, species die, flora, fauna die, humans die. Right? So we know that that is not a pathway that we can actually be on. And it's interesting that what we've seen is the political piece of this move over time. Paris was a milestone, but it was only a milestone. In terms of the political commitment to move, we now have a new administration in the US, and I think that's we're already seeing the impact that that is having on the global political economics and commitment to climate change, action on climate change. If I thought my job was really complex and very busy at the beginning of November, now it's really, really bad in a good way, because now everyone wants to act and act quickly. And people are referring to India and China. I mean, we're already seeing dramatic changes in the political economics and commitments to the race to zero, as people are referring to it, but fundamental decisions to change the future of economies of the largest emitters. And yes, it is geopolitics. Yes, it is very complex. And yes, in the middle of this, there is also a major climate justice discussion. A lot of the energy that's currently locked into the planet that is impacting the G77 plus, as we would refer to them, but the developing countries, the emerging markets, they didn't put that energy into the atmosphere. This is not a problem of their causing. Now, if they carry on the same development pathway that we all used in the G8, G7, G20 countries, then yes, they are the new problem of the future, but they didn't get us to where we are today. And so part of the political economic challenge is addressing, if you like, the crimes of history and how to get to a better future. And there is a trade-off in there, and it is a permanent and ongoing discussion. What I can say is that it is possible, as we often say here, to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so the political negotiations, the international negotiations around climate change, increasingly seeing that happen. That you can have a conversation about climate justice, loss and damage, who did what to who, at the same time as agreeing that the future will look different and making commitments to that. And that's a major change from what we saw in the past 20 years of the climate negotiations. It's a fundamental shift. And the reason is, of course, that essentially business is already moving in this direction, right? It was 2014, the International Energy Agency predicted it would take 36 years to get to an average price of 5 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. And that was their prediction. It took 6 years. So 36 years suddenly took only 6. And so when we look at the speed and depth and impact of technological change across a number of sectors, it's way outstripping where anyone thought we would end up. So what we're doing, I referred earlier to this speed of change and our inability to deal with it. Certain sectors are moving at hyperspeed, and they are driving down the cost, the difference in cost between old technology and new technology at rapid rates. And part of that, of course, comes down to what's the role of government? What is the role of the taxpayers' money? Where can we invest our money, as taxpayers' money, now to get us where we want to be in 2050, which is basically a net zero world. And that really is where I spend a lot of my time advising sovereigns. Both are major shareholders, so most of our, I guess, are sitting in the UK. We spend a lot of time talking to UK, all the way through to developing countries and the most afflicted. And so the issue is long-term planning. Okay, you're currently here and you want to be there. How do you get there? And the key is starting here and working backwards, not forecasting, backcasting. Right? That's a fundamental change in science, and it's driven because of this fundamental change in the major fundamentals of our planet. We have to think where we want to be and then work backwards to where we are today. Basing any projections on history doesn't work because things are changing so rapidly. It's a wider use of financial instruments. Generally, politicians like cutting ribbons. So we invest in projects. It's all about projects. Projects won't get us to zero. Project by project is an incremental approach, and it will not get us there in the time that we have available. So how do we change financial systems? How do we incentivize money not to go to brown projects? How do we incentivize money to go to green projects, the economy of the future that we actually want to see? And that actually literally costs nothing to the taxpayer. You change the regulations. And what we're starting to see, and I think what we're starting to see in the public finance management sector, so ministries of finance, central banks, is a very strong push on the commercial side. So the sustainability banking network, a huge raft of pension funds, investment funds, hedge funds, anything that ends in a fund, driving their money and wanting their money to go in a direction which is A, looks good for them as a business, but B, also doesn't end up with what we refer to as stranded assets. So you didn't want to be the person who invested in steam trains when the electric train came out. And when I talk to the large hedge fund managers and pension fund managers who are investing money for 20, 30 years from now, they don't want to be locked into investments for technologies that won't actually be in use in 20 or 30 years. So this has driven a fundamental change in the way that people think about investing money and actually do invest money. And what we're then seeing on the other side of this is a change in the return on capital. So the investment returns. This used to be a sort of corporate social responsibility type activity. Let's do good for the planet, keep everyone happy. Now it's just hard-nosed business. And what we're seeing is that the public financial management side is taking a lot of information, a lot of lessons learned, and a lot of comfort from the way that they're watching private capital move at the moment. And a better, I think, and for this, I think in many ways we can thank Greta, but others who went before her for many, many, many decades, in a better appreciation and understanding of the political economy of these transitions. Interestingly, the first words that came out of the new administration in the US when they talk about the Green Deal and climate change, the first thing they talk about is jobs. And that's not just some cynical approach to politics. It's very real. The jobs of tomorrow in some sectors are just not the jobs of today. So you fundamentally need to think about your tertiary education system. You fundamentally need to think about how you move people from one economic activity to another. Where do you invest your money? Because if you cannot carry on the activity, those people will become, you can do nothing about it, become unemployed, they become a burden on the state, they become disaffected voters, etc., etc. But fundamentally, there's a more deeper economic issue here. And that's why, for example, the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, have raised this as a fundamental economic issue. It's not just about politics anymore. It's not about, are you going to vote for me? It's about economics. It's about where do we invest the money of today for the economies of tomorrow. As you can imagine, we could go on forever and ever and ever about where you specifically put that money to have the biggest impact. I released a paper last year on what are the other things you could be doing with this money. And a lot of it is about how do you invest in people? How do you invest in the just transition? How do you incentivize technology? How do you get behind sectoral reform and protecting those who are impacted by it? And that's a very different dialogue than where's the next project I can invest in, which is traditionally where the dialogue has been. That's not systemic change. Anyway, thanks ever so much for the invite, and I'll try and answer any questions I can.
It's a very compelling piece, Mark, of both how to incentivize the right behavior, but also how we may also have some options to invest correctly. I guess there are some immediate questions about who compensates the losers that may come up in the chat. Now, though, I want to move on and introduce Peter Dillon, who is our last speaker this evening. Peter studied modern history at Trinity, and he is working at the moment in the United States in Houston with ExxonMobil, but he spent 5 years in Guyana prior to his move to Houston with the company. So I think this is going to be a very fascinating position piece on the importance of the oil industry. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Now for something completely different. No. So we, all of the serious oil companies take climate change very seriously these days. You'll see aggressive methane reduction targets, almost universal support, including my own employer for the Paris Climate Accord. Net zero targets tend to be longer term than what we just heard in the call earlier today. 2050 is the time horizon that's being talked about by most of the oil companies for net zero. And we recognize as corporate citizens, we have got an essential role to play in achieving those emissions offsets with the well-grounded science and climate change that exists today. I want to touch on two things really. I want to touch on one thing, talk a little bit about the pandemic, as was in the brief, and then talk a little bit more about the dual challenge of energy going forward and climate change. The pandemic was quite interesting. It led to a couple of exposing a number of areas in the energy sector. One is in Texas. I guess Claire's in Texas too, down the road in College Station. We did have a major disruption with the winter event that we had recently. Most of the week without power, and there are lots of reasons for that. A very large one was lack of winterization of the power generation equipment that exists within Texas, and that's going to have to addressed. And Texas has long prided itself on a free market, deregulated sector, and ERCOT is the only electricity grid that serves Texas that is isolated from all of the other grids in the United States to avoid federal regulation, quite frankly. And it's exposed that the market incentive can only take you so far to prepare for what were once extreme events, but now have happened. And they have happened with an increasing level of frequency as well. There's one in 2011, and those recommendations are not followed through. So there's another element of climate change, different weather patterns, and it's going to need to change investment patterns or lead to some further regulatory intervention in a sector if the free market isn't doing it of its own accord. But if you step back to my own sector, which is oil and gas, I've been doing this now for 20 years. Really, it was obvious the impact was on supply and demand last year. We had a unique situation of a double black swan event in the oil and gas sector, which was in the first part of the year, kind of in the March timeframe. The Saudis and the Russians entered into a major contest for who can produce the most oil and gas. Massive supply surge, lots of barrels put into the marketplace, almost concurrent with COVID taking off. And so you end up with a surge in supply and this exponential drop in demand that continued through the year. There were the resurgences and then the dying away of lockdowns through the various countries. I get to see the data on gasoline station consumption and aviation. You've got the largest private sector refining footprint, and you saw those cycles through gas station filling usage through the year, and aviation is still a shadow of what it was pre-COVID. So do behaviors change for businesses? People have adapted to Zoom, those unnecessary business trips. One of the long-term consequences of this may well be, a greater use of economy when it comes to transportation, particularly aviation, which is a major driver for oil consumption. And so that probably slows the rate of growth that are in some of the old forecasts that didn't anticipate an event like this pandemic that has occurred and is still, influencing oil and gas demand today. Now, a lot of that led to rumors of the death of the sector, which are greatly exaggerated. Best example of that would be when pricing famously went negative for West Texas Intermediate crude. That's a quirk of logistics. And so West Texas Intermediate crude is produced in the Permian Basin out in Midland, around the town of Midland. And it's logistically highly constrained to get to the Gulf Coast. And so when the buyers at the end of the pipe dropped off because the refineries that are located along the coast no longer had any demand for their products, there was a timing delta for being able to shut down the wells in West Texas. That meant there was no choice but to pay people to take their crude, which led to this quirk of gas is, having to pay people to take your oil and gas. Otherwise, there were some serious pipeline issues that would have occurred in that Texas basin. It's not symptomatic of a broader problem with the industry. And the way you saw that is with markets such as Brent and the Atlantic Basin markets. These trade on month plus 2, month plus 1 bases to the buyers, typically in China and India for the crude cargoes. And there you've got more than sufficient time to adjust your planned production based upon the event of the pandemic. So if you look at those indices, you don't see anything like the disconnect that occurred with West Texas Intermediate crude. So function of the market working, it led to the supply eventually being turned down, matching demand, and now we're going through that recovery process as the economies recover. When you look at that point on economic recovery, energy usage is strongly correlated to GDP and GDP development. And so today, hydrocarbons, which is really coal, gas, and oil, about 55 to 60% of the world's energy mix, depending how you cut it. It's 55, 60%, somewhere in that ballpark, and there's all different sorts of sources, but somewhere in there. Clearly, that's a focus of everybody here today and in the now. What's also going to be happening over the next couple of years is demand for energy growth is going to increase. Populations are increasing, and ultimately the non-OECD sector is going to be the driver for increased energy demand through the 2040s. So we and the sector sees about a 20% increase in aggregate energy demand over that time period on a global basis from where we are today. Now, what's unique is it does disconnect with the OECD. And so the developed world, it has got the wealth, it's got the innovation, it's got the legislative mandates to contribute to this changing energy paradigm. And so you basically start seeing a contraction in the connection between GDP growth and energy usage in the OECD. So that kind of offsets that 20% growth quite a bit. And that's the efficiency. It's an incredible surge of renewables investment. While the non-OECD, which doesn't have access to the same resources, for simple economic development, Africa, Asia, South America, continues to expand its GDP using more traditional sources of energy, your coal, gas, and oil. Now, factoring all those things in together, there are 13 models that sit behind the Paris Climate Accord. And of those 13, achieving the 2 degrees centigrade or below, above pre-industrial levels for the target by 2040, achieving it, getting that 2 degrees, oil and gas demand in 2040 will be about the same as it is today. So consumption levels on 12 of the 13 models, it drops down to 50% in some of them, with tremendous growth in the rate of renewables, faster than an energy source has been seen before. So we think that there is a clear role, and in fact, the oil and gas industry is not going anywhere. The supplies of the modern sources of oil and gas drop off very rapidly. So these fields deplete in quite 18-month, 2-year curves. And so the requirement for ongoing exploration and development to meet this growing energy demand driven by the non-OECD sector, which is seeking its fair right, talking about social justice for economic development, will be supplied by the more traditional sources of hydrocarbons. Now, what that doesn't relieve us of is a responsibility to do something about those emissions. And what gets a lot of coverage is in the renewable sector, and a lot of oil companies are becoming power companies. Energy companies was a quote from earlier, investing in solar, investing in wind, investing in other forms of renewable energy, hydro. What really needs a lot more money to be invested into it is emissions capture and reduction and sequestration technology. If you accept that, and you can beat the 50%, maybe the world exceeds expectation, gets it down to 40% of today's demand, maybe even lower, it's still going to be a very significant source of the mix. And so if you want to still be able to use those energy sources, but reduce their emissions footprint, billions more dollars need to be put into technologies to capture emissions. Over half of energy use in 2040 will be industrial based. Those are furnaces, factories, thermal use factories. They don't need electricity to run, they need thermal energy. That thermal energy today for steel, for ceramics, for glass manufacturing requires natural gas to be burnt for the chemical process of construction of their products. So emissions capture on the back of these facilities, emissions capture with carbon capture sequestration from the back of power facilities really needs a lot more focus than it's received today. It's not the glamorous end of the energy transition, but it has the potential to make a disproportionate positive impact when you reflect upon the scale that hydrocarbons are still likely to have in the global economy in that next 20-year period. And undoubtedly there's a transition. Those percentages are unlike anything that's occurred before, but it's going to be gradual. And therefore you need to do something to improve the base. The base are the old sources of energy. but use them in new ways. Use them in ways that are more environmentally responsible, because the technology now exists. I'm not in the coal sector, but the phrase clean coal is a coal facility with massively reduced carbon footprints out of the back of that facility. Natural gas, we have got a pilot plant that actually has zero emissions coming out of the natural gas facility that we're testing for commercial scale at the moment. And these all then allow people to access abundant sources of energy without trying to achieve what is unlikely to be an achievable rate of growth in the non-hydrocarbon sector, to be realistic with this. So I think the challenge is there. Oil and gas companies want to be part of it. We have to be part of it because we are part of the emissions that are developed for use by the buyers of our products. But there are ways to get there. There are ways that 50% of the energy mix is not necessarily bad news. There are ways where that has a very different emissions profile than what it has done historically. And we're committing the resources to try and make that happen, to improve the current forecast performance, which really doesn't have a lot built in for carbon capture, doesn't have a lot built in for sequestration and general emissions reductions technologies. But economic development needs to happen. The part of the world that has not had the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and the economic growth of the OECD, they have a requirement for access to cheap, competitive, affordable sources of energy. And more often than that, that will be from the hydrocarbon sector. So there's a few thoughts from myself.
Peter, thank you very much. Extremely thought-provoking. And I guess there are also whole sectors of other materials that depend on hydrocarbons, and those would be chemicals and the products that you make
Waxes,
from them.
chemicals, paints, all of those things, yeah.
Good. So thank you all speakers for such precision and such eloquence in making your points. I now want to come to the questions from the chat and pose these. I will come back to the specific technical question from Jonathan Rose, which relates to whether actually cleaning particulates out of the air may further increase global temperatures. I'll allow the speakers to comment on that if they'd like to, but I looked this up quickly. This research is correct, and it comes from various geology journals, but the point is more that the particulates are masking the true temperature increase, not that there's a further increase in temperature through air clean, if you understand what I mean, but perhaps others will wish to take that on. So the next question is related to how Trinity student population rates Greta Thunberg, and this I think that we maybe cannot comment on in too much detail, but if there are students on the call, please identify yourselves and you can let everybody know the answer to that. The next question is coming to everybody, and it's about this idea of genetic modification of plants or crops, so as to either prevent extinction or improve yield. And the question is whether we should, whether we should take those kinds of interventions, not knowing yet whether they would be successful. I don't know, Claire, if you want to come in first, and then if other speakers also have answers to that question.
Yeah, sure. So, so one part of the question is, comparison of genetically modified trees and genetically modified crops. And it is true that it's more difficult to genetically modify trees because they have such long lifespans. So, like the white bark pine, which is one of the threatened trees, doesn't produce cones until it's 60 years old. So it's much more difficult to to work with trees than it is with, annual crops. But certainly there have already been successes with genetically, okay, it's going to depend on what you mean by success. So I'm taking success here to mean you could produce a tree which is resilient or resistant in certain kinds of ways. And there have been successes in doing that, certainly in fruit trees. But in terms of trees that are essentially wild trees, there's sort of the signature case for this is the American chestnut in the United States. So that's a tree that virtually is essentially functionally extinct in the US. It was once huge chestnut forests all across the eastern side of the United States, and an invasive fungus came in about 100 years ago, I think, maybe a bit longer than that, and basically destroyed all those forests. So there are now no big chestnut forest trees, but it was very important sort of culturally and environmentally, those chestnut forests. And so a team of scientists have genetically modified some of those chestnuts using, there are two different ways of doing it, but I think the one that has been most successful is using a gene from the Chinese chestnut, which is actually immune to this particular fungus. And so they have now produced an American chestnut with this other gene that could resist this fungus. And so they're trying to get permission at the moment to plant these trees out. But of course, it's highly controversial. Because people don't want genetically modified trees, and they argue, well, look, you know, we could, even if we did recreate these forests, they wouldn't be the great wild forests of American chestnuts because they wouldn't be wild. And then there's lots of debate about, well, what do we mean by wild? But that issue applies also to potential changes with respect to with trees for climate resilience, so trees that are threatened because it's becoming too warm for them, which is true of the whitebark pine. It's high up on mountains, it's getting warmer on the top of mountains, you know, the trees can't cope with the warmer temperatures, so what are you going to do with them? You could move them, that's another possibility, so that, and that's also controversial. But other people may want to come in on this.
I'll just add from in New Zealand, we have a similar situation as your chestnut with kauri, and there's a fungus, kauri dieback, which is causing a lot of those kauri, which are hundreds and hundreds of years old, to die. But I think for the culture here, genetic modification would be too uncomfortable, because the kauri and indeed most of our trees and our heritage here is well associated with Maori, and you know, that would be, I think, for Indigenous native communities, that would be too much for them to contemplate. So I think those solutions will probably be determined by which countries you're in.
I think that seems like a pretty sensible summary, and thanks, Claire, for also giving us a lot more detail. I wanted to come to Bob Pedley's question, which is to all of you, and perhaps we'll bring Mark in first, if that's okay, because this is a fascinating question. So what do the speakers think the world will look like when the climate eventually reaches a new stable condition?
Gosh, that sounds like me trying to explain to my son what the world was like before an iPad. He still doesn't believe that I didn't grow up with video games. I think at the moment as one of the weird things that I do speak and spend time with futurists, because as I said, this thing about pick a point in the future and work backwards. There are and this is all going to start sounding a bit weird, but there are so many different pathways from where we are today going forwards. It's very difficult to try and say what we think the world would look like in 100 or 200 years, because there are so many millions of decisions that will be made between now and then. In terms of where do we need to be? Well, I mean, essentially we know what that answer is. And the answer is we need to be living on the planet in a way that enables us to interact with various different systems on the planet in a way that means that life will continue to develop over thousands of years going forwards. What we know is at the moment that the way that we interact with all sorts of different systems on our planet just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. I mean, the way that we use water, the way that we use, you know, a whole bunch of resources that are finite. I mean, you know, what's the big plan, guys, right? You know, so the key at the moment really does come down to efficiency. When you look back across the past 100, 200 years, given what we know today, I mean, it's been incredibly inefficient in the way that we've gone about doing it. So I think the first step is, how do we become much, much more efficient in producing what we consume and in consuming what we consume? And so when you look at, for example, if you take food waste, that we were referring to that sort of area before, over 40% of food in sort of the global north ends up getting thrown away. 40% of food. I mean, just mind-blowing numbers. And I used to be in the agricultural sector. Everyone talks about, oh, well, it's all these crops that are lost in developing countries. I mean, it's absolute hogwash. 40% of global food is thrown away by consumers in OECD countries. And a vast majority of that is excess food. So for those of you who spent lots of time in the US and you're wondering why your plate is so full of food and why no one understands what a doggy bag is, I mean, that's where the vast majority of the trillions of calories that are lost every year are lost. Having spent so many years living in developing countries, I can tell you for sure, those calories aren't lost. They may be repurposed. They may go into animals. They might get used for other things. No one throws food away in developing countries. You can't, you die. So the answer, what does it look like in 100, 200 years from now? A whole bunch of people who consume understanding what their choices mean and what the impact is, and the choices that fit within a framework that enables us to fit with the planetary systems that we have available, water, land, all these other things, because it really does impact what's going to happen to your children, your grandchildren, and everyone who comes behind you. And it's no longer sort of, you know, this tree huggy, fluffy, no. This is real decisions having real impacts. It's just taken us a long time to get there, to understand that those are the choices we're actually making today.
And perhaps I'll come back to you in a minute after the others, but do you see a change in legal status for the planet in that timescale also? Mark Allaway, can we come to you?
Yes, Charlotte, I'm here.
So the question is, what do you think the world looks like when the climate does eventually stabilize, and what things will have changed, I guess, the big things?
Well, firstly, I don't think I'll be here anymore. So I'm not sure. It's very difficult to say. But as Mark was just talking about iPads, I see enormous change in what's happened in my lifetime, and I think all of us have. When I used to work in the oil industry, I used to work for Exxon, actually, Esso in the UK, and we built a massive computer model of the Brent oil field. And I was a reservoir engineer doing that. And we used to send it across to Houston every night to run it on a Cray computer. And I said to my sons, and one of my sons, Richard, is on the line. He's asked a question, and my sister is also on the line. But I said to my sons, you know, we used to use a Cray computer. They were supercomputers. They were amazing. And they looked it up, and it has the computing power of an iPad 2. And this was state of the art at the time. So what changes are we going to see in the next 10, 20, 30 years? If you look back 20 years, 40 years, the changes are enormous. It's difficult to say. But if people take it seriously, and Sue had asked a good question, sort of, are really people going to take climate change seriously? I think they have to. And the big companies, the big opinions, I think they're going to. And if the politicians, I mean, there are going to be obstacles on the way. But if people take it seriously, it's going to be a very different world. I mean, maybe some people will be living on Mars. Who knows? It'll be interesting to see.
Actually, I'll put your son's question to you, if I may, Mark, because it's a really good question as well. And it says, you know, the focus on shifts in economic policy may not adequately address how costly this is going to be, and at least in the short term. So how can we get governments to shift towards more environmentally friendly metrics? What are your views on that?
Well, just like the classifications of companies are not appropriate for climate change anymore, the classifications of companies on stock markets, GDP has its limitations. And it is a good question, and I'll give an answer, but I think others should comment at this time. there was actually a really interesting report on BBC just a few days ago on the BBC News about somebody who's trying to develop an alternative to GDP, which includes the value of natural resources. And they made the point that Amazon.com is worth, I don't know, $50 trillion, I think they said, something like that, some enormous amount of money. Whereas the Amazon jungle is worth nothing until you cut it down and use it for agricultural purposes, which is what President Bolsonaro of Brazil has been pushing for. But the Amazon jungle has an enormous value to the planet. You know, it doesn't belong just to Brazil, it belongs to the world. So what they do in Brazil, the politics of Brazil, is very relevant to all of us. So you have to put a value on those resources. And there was somebody, I forget, somewhere in the UK, I think, one of the universities, who was looking at an alternative to GDP to include these measures and had new metrics, just like you need new metrics for companies on adaptation and mitigation to a carbon neutral environment. But it would be interesting to see what others think of it. Those in the sector and Lynn.
Sorry, I was just going to say that New Zealand has a wellness budget. So so government introduced its own wellness budget, so the parameters are different. And the other piece is that there's government departments and increasingly businesses are setting a carbon budget for their year. So as well as setting your financial budget, you're setting a carbon budget.
Yeah, very important. And do you have a vision, Lynn, also for how the world will look when things stabilize, or at least the major things that will have changed? I think we've had efficiency technology, haven't we? Please.
Yeah, in the area I work, it will be around consumption. And not that I'll be here as Mark said, or in fact, any of us will be here in 100 and odd years' time. But so design for, so products will be designed A, to last, and B, to be reused and if not reused, recycled. And I think that's certainly where we're seeing the innovation going globally.
Yeah, because it's another very good point about trying to reach net zero, that it's not all about electricity and transport. I think Peter Dillon also referred to the vast amounts of carbon that are emitted by, if you like, heavy industries. So this move to recycling must be very important to maintain the carbon in place, as it were, that's been embedded in those materials. Peter, I wondered if you wanted to come in and answer this question about how do you get the government to do the right thing, and who pays?
Yeah, I think there's that's going to vary around the world, and in the OECD countries, there's the taxpayers that have a willingness generally to participate in. Sometimes subsidies are needed to get some of these developments up and running, and they withdraw those later on when they are sustainable. Some of the big wind farms in Texas, it is the largest renewable state in the US, but there's an annually renewed subsidy from Congress that sits behind a lot of those initial investments that occurred. Not so much now, but in the formation period. I think it gets more difficult when you turn to the developing world, where most of the increasing demand for energy is going to come from. So, you know, I've just spent 5 years living in Guyana, so that's the northern part of the Amazon rainforest. That's about an hour from my house, and there's the Suriname and Guyana have a very similar view that their oil wealth, they're going to use it to preserve their rainforests, and they are stopping, they're replanting. They've got the most pristine parts of the northern Amazon basin are in those two countries. Brazil's just got larger, but there's been a lot of vested interest with the cattle industry that doesn't exist in these two smaller countries. And they view oil, they justify in their own mind the use of hydrocarbons as being okay, because they're also going to preserve the lungs of the planet, because now they no longer need to develop those areas, and instead they'll do ecotourism, they'll do other ways to monetize the resource without cutting it down, so to speak, or shipping wild animals around the world, which is pretty serious business down there. So I think they get it. Most of these governments get it now. And the phrase that you hear I hear is that we want to do it like Norway. And so it's kind of this, there's an inherent conflict, isn't there, about hydrocarbon development and having a hydrocarbon resource and wanting to be responsible and an environmentalist as well. And the Norwegians did it through the creation of their sovereign wealth fund to invest in sustainable economic development around the world. And in the case of Guyana, they paid them $200 million to stop cutting down the rainforest before Guyana found oil, so it's to preserve that area. And that's the model that you hear more frequently these days. We have this bounty that we've discovered, and it's only fair to our citizens to develop it so that they can benefit from economic development like everybody else has. But we're going to do it in a way that it has a less negative impact on the planet than the predecessors in the 70s and the 80s, where there really wasn't the investor community focus or even the global focus on many of these issues that face us today. So they're starting from a better place. They know they don't want to be a corrupt economy. Everybody knows what West Africa looks like. They know they don't want to be like that. They know they don't want to be held responsible for making the climate situation worse. They're trying to be creative from the first instance, and it costs money. And therefore, there's a cycle. So in Guyana's example, they realize it's going to be the back end of the 2020s before they can. They're viewing this as a transitional decade to a 100% renewable economy. So they are going to build 1 or 2 new hydrocarbon power stations. There's a gas one in the news right now using their new gas. A decade and a half from now, we want to be 100% renewables, but we're going to take it one step at a time because it's all that our economy can bear. And there are better metrics than GDP to measure this. Brunei, somewhere in it, there's the National Happiness Index in one country. I can't remember which one it is. It begins with a B. Bhutan has that. But in Guyana, we use that for shorthand. They're looking at life expectancy. They're looking at deaths at birth. It's a far more fundamental thing than easy economic metrics. They're just a shorthand for development. But if we put that to one side, I'll shift to basically socioeconomic metrics. And those socioeconomic metrics, Guyana is not one of the world's poorest countries by any shots, but they're really bad metrics. And so they want to use this revenue to responsibly develop and improve their lifestyle up to the OECD standards. Everybody has that right.
Thank you, Peter. Claire, I wondered if you might choose to come in on some of these points about justice between different economies and different countries.
Well, actually, I did want to say something else. I think it kind of came up.
Please say what you want to.
It came up in what Peter was saying, which is that there is a difficult kind of balance between focusing on climate change and some other kinds of things. And so I think one of the questions asked about environmentally friendly metrics and also about climate change. But one of the difficulties is that sometimes pursuing climate policies are not necessarily environmentally friendly policies. So you would have to kind of make decisions between those kinds of things. And in addition, climate doesn't seem to me to be the only thing that we need to think about that's really important. And I don't think we've really mentioned biodiversity very much, but there's a big issue about extinction and biodiversity loss at the moment that's very threatening to humans as well as to all the other species. And so when we're thinking about climate measures, I think we also need to consider other kinds of really urgent concerns and as well as climate change, and that those climate policies have to take biodiversity in particular into account as well.
That seems completely right and rather difficult. Surely it's extremely difficult to quantify which is more important in cases where there's a tension. I wondered also, Claire, if you wanted to comment a bit on how you see the world having changed, at least from an ethical or philosophical point of view, when this is over, and assuming it's solved in 100 or 200 years.
I'm not sure I think it will be solved in 100 or 200 years, but presumably if it has, people will have changed such that they are thinking much more seriously about living sustainably and about future generations. I mean, that seems to be, you know, if we've managed to survive that long with a reasonably sized human population that's living reasonably well, then we must have solved some kinds of ethical problems. So yeah, so I guess that's all I want to say. I guess we're at the end of time, so I don't want to talk on for ages. Tempting though it is.
Well, thank you very much. And you're absolutely right, because unfortunately we have already lost Mark just a second or so ago, Sadler. But I really want to now bring the discussion to a close, to thank everybody that put questions into the chat. And there were many that we unfortunately couldn't come to, but I refer you to those. I want to turn again to the remaining speakers on the call, to Mark Allaway, to Lynn Mays, to Claire Palmer, to Peter Dillon, and to the now absent Mark Sadler, and thank you very sincerely for your time this evening. I want to thank all of the audience for your time, your strong engagement with this very important and fascinating topic, and wish you all well. Hope to see you at some point in the future in Trinity College for a continuation of the discussion. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you.